Now, the Trump administration has given mixed signals about the ultimate goal of the offensive against Iran. But right from the outset, it seemed like overthrowing Iran's rulers is a key goal. But what's the legal basis for all of this? DW's Cherry Chan looked into it.
President Trump keeps hinting at regime change in Iran, even urging Iranians to take action.
When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take.
But can a country legally go to war just to topple another government? The UN Charter is crystal clear. Countries cannot threaten or use force against another state's territorial integrity or political independence.
So there is no such thing as an international law doctrine of unilateral regime change.
But there are two situations where the use of force is allowed. One, under UN Security Council authorization, where all member countries on the Council agree.
Under the United Nations Charter, under Chapter 7, the United Nations could embark on a collective security action to protect people.
That's exactly what happened in the first Gulf War. After Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the UN Security Council passed a resolution that gave member states the legal authority to use force to liberate Kuwait. And the second exception is self-defense, like the US did in Afghanistan in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. President George W. Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan, saying the US had to dismantle terrorist networks and prevent future attacks, framing it as a lawful act of self-defense.
There's been a big debate as to whether there should be Security Council resolutions authorizing removals of regimes that pose fundamental threats to their own citizens.
The US invasion led to a regime change in Kabul, at least until 2021, when the Taliban returned to power.
But we can see with the experience of Libya, of Iraq, of Afghanistan, what goes wrong when regime changes are attempted.
But back to Iran, Trump now says the strikes are also self-defense. He insists the country is developing missiles that could soon hit the US. But soon could mean many things, and experts strongly challenge that claim.
There has to be that kind of evidence that somebody's about to push a button, and it would have to be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. And I have not seen any such evidence.
But what we see now is the US president keeps shifting his reasons for going to war with Iran. Earlier, he said the war was about destroying Iran's nuclear and missile programs, which Trump called an imminent threat to the US and its allies. And in January, Trump even threatened military action over Tehran's violent crackdown on protesters. Regime change isn't considered a valid reason to go to war, but Trump's shifting rationale all seem to point in the same direction. And the US choosing to go to war without a clear legal basis could mark a real turning point for the international order.
My Prime Minister, I'm a Canadian, Mark Carney, has talked about the rupture in the international system. I think what Trump and his regime are doing is a fundamental rupture, and because they are not respecting international law in any degree.
Marko Milanovic is a professor of international law at the University of Reading in England. I asked him whether there's any strong legal basis for the US and Israeli strikes on Iran.
It's not strong at all. So there is simply no case that these strikes are lawful. The strikes are, on the contrary, completely unlawful. That's because they were not authorized by the Security Council and because Israel and the United States could not rely on the right to self-defense to unilaterally use force against Iran. So the strikes are simply, there's not a single state and not a single, scholar that I'm aware of who has actually argued that these strikes are even arguably lawful.
Okay, so if they were indeed illegal, what's in place to hold Israel and the US accountable? Will there be any real consequences?
Well, unfortunately, it is other states that decide what the consequences of this illegality will be. The only centralized body that could theoretically do something is the UN Security Council, but the United States has a veto in the Security Council. And that's why, just like when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Security Council can't do anything about the fact that the United States and Israel unlawfully attacked Iran. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, other states took various measures, including serious economic sanctions against Russia. I don't think it's very likely that this will happen in this particular case, if for no other reason than because Iran doesn't really have that many friends, and Iran itself is a serial violator of international law. So the consequences, as such as they are mainly reputational. They go as to the credibility of the United States and Israel. They harm the international legal order as such, but I don't think any direct consequences will follow from the illegality that they have perpetrated.
Well, let's talk about the harm to the legal order then. I mean, do repeated exceptions to the rules on the use of force for self-defense risk normalizing preemptive wars like this, or even regime change?
Well, they very much do. I mean, it actually, if you look at the long history of international law, international relations, war used to be perfectly normal, perfectly legal. It was the bitter experience of that kind of regime where, states can resort to force simply because they think some other state is a threat, what that kind of thing can lead to, and that was 2 world wars, that we arrived at the current regime where the UN Charter prohibits states from using force. Now, that kind of order can disintegrate, and you can argue that it is certainly in the process of deterioration and crisis, if not outright disintegration. And we have seen this from the war in Iraq in 2003 to various smaller kinds of incidents, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to the recent attack on Venezuela, where again, the United States, without any kind of permission from the Security Council or without any kind of basis in self-defense, attacked Venezuela, kidnapped its president, killed 100 people there, right? So the fact that other states, including European allies of the United States, are reacting in such a tepid way itself contributes to the erosion of these norms. And I'm not really sure that we want to live in a world where these rules don't exist.
And you talk about erosion there. Is that also of the legal framework surrounding war? Or does international law still meaningfully constrain state behavior at all?
So international law does meaningfully constrain or regulate state behavior in many, many different contexts. I mean, you cannot do anything in terms of international trade, international investment, international civil aviation, technology, telecommunications. You can't do any of that without international law. International law, in that sense, makes the kind of globalized world that we live in possible. But the erosion of these norms governing war can have really horrible systemic consequences. That can happen both at the level of the UN Charter, which governs the initial resort to force. I mean, whether states have the right to resort to force in the first place. And the kind of erosion that we have seen can also affect the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, which governs how wars are fought. And we have certainly seen in several past conflicts, including Gaza, Sudan, but also obviously Russia, Ukraine, a very unrestrained use of force that affects civilians greatly, that kills many innocent people. And those kinds of wars do unfortunately threaten the foundations of the international legal order. They threaten its very credibility. And they, of course, cause an enormous amount of harm.
And, a lot of people would argue that there's a bit of a double standard when it comes to Western states condemning some wars while justifying others. How does that affect the credibility and enforcement of international law? When
you say there's a bit of a double standard, that's a bit of an understatement. There's always been double standards. Hypocrisy is what states do. And by the way, not just Western states. So, you have Russia criticizing the United States and Israel for invading Iran when it is Russia that invaded Ukraine. You see what I mean? So this kind of hypocrisy and double standards is not some kind of Western invention or monopoly. It is something that states have routinely done. The problem is that states normally try, when they engage in these type of activities, they at least try to provide some kind of plausible justification. They try to persuade other states. When you look at, for example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the United States and the United Kingdom expended an enormous amount of political and legal capital to persuade the UN, to persuade the international community as a whole, to persuade their own people that this kind of war was justified. And in the case of Mr. Trump in particular, as well as the Netanyahu administration in Israel, what we see is a systematic erosion of any kind of commitment to the rule of law, to any kind of legal constraint, whether international or domestic. And that is a hugely threatening phenomenon. So that kind of lawless behavior, unfortunately, affects the entirety of the system, as does the failure of other states to react to it in any kind of rigorous way. So, for example, if we look at Europe, no state has said that what the United States and Israel have done is lawful. But in terms of forceful condemnation, we have maybe Spain as the only state that has really risen up to the occasion. And when you have such a tepid reaction, such a limited reaction, it is sort of inevitable that the legal order will be disintegrated.
Professor Marko Milanovic, that was really interesting to get all of your analysis there. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And for a look at the legal dimension of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, I'm joined by Matthias Goldmann, professor of international law at the EBS Law School in Wiesbaden, Germany. So, Professor Goldmann, Washington has been saying that the strikes on Iran are meant to restore deterrence. Does international law recognize deterrence as a legal justification for force?
No, not at all. The only right that states have to take recourse to armed force is when they are attacked, so when they're acting in self-defense. But that requires that you have already been attacked. And before that moment, the only military action that international law recognizes is military action authorized by the Security Council. There have been some exemptions where the General Assembly also has been deemed to be entitled to authorize military force. But what is absolutely prohibited is a unilateral strike that is meant to deter a state.
Well, Israel has been saying that its strikes on Iran are self-defense. So under international law, how far does that self-defense argument go?
It doesn't go as far as Israel claims that it goes. The point is that if you allow self-defense at the moment where the attack is not yet imminent and where it's not even likely or not even probable that there will be any attack, which could not be rejected by other means, there would be endless violence. The UN Charter really is meant to reduce violence and to de-escalate conflicts. And if one allows self-defense, even at the moment where there's only a small chance that somewhere in the future, maybe Iran might attack, the UN Charter is not worth the paper it was written on.
All right, but if the U.S. and Israel continue hitting Iranian targets without UN approval, what legal consequences, if any, could they face internationally?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So many people are asking that. What is international worth if international law worth if there is no international force that could enforce it? But there is a number of effects. So one effect is reputational. Who is going to make international agreements with the United States or with Israel if they violate international law in the way they're doing it right now? So they will suffer some damage to their credibility and also their ability to conduct negotiations. The other thing is there might be consequences that other states, third states, might take unilaterally. We've actually seen that already. Pedro Sánchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, has prohibited the United States from using military bases in Spain for exactly that reason. So they've now transferred some of their planes from Spain to Germany. But in Germany, there is even a constitutional requirement, that the government doesn't permit third states to use their territory in violation of international law. So that issue might come up. The government has not gone into that direction yet, but there might be people bringing suits. And so that might be a serious limitation for the US ability to conduct operations in the Middle East if European states deny them access to their military bases or the usage of their military bases. And, in the long term, there might be even more consequences in terms of reparation, for example, reparation claims.
That was Matthias Goldmann, professor of international law at EBS Law School in Wiesbaden, Germany. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.